if you have a situation where whenever a Democrat's in office, you can just throw open the border and import 10, 15, 20 million people illegally, but you can't ever get them out because, of the injunctions and the lawsuits and this and that, then we're screwed as a country.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Monday, April 21st. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP co-founder and president Tom Bevan and Washington Bureau Chief Carl Cannon. So, gentlemen, Pope Francis, who was the first Latin American pontiff, died today at the age of 88. He did emerge on Easter Sunday to bless the crowd in St. Peter's Square, and Vice President J.D. Vance was in Rome and was one of the last people to meet with the Pope before he died. So, Carl, let's start with that. How should we remember the legacy of Pope Francis?
Well, before we get to the legacy, Andy, let's just start with his last day on Earth, on this mortal coil. His medical team at the Vatican had told him he'd had pneumonia, he'd been very ill, he'd been in pain, had told him he needed to rest and stay away from people, and he didn't want to do that. And he got in the Pope mobile and he toured the Vatican. He blessed the people who were there. I think for them it was a thrill of a lifetime, and I think it was God's gift to them, and maybe to Pope Francis himself, that he was able to go out the way he wanted to, which is, blessing people and spreading the gospel and mingling with the people. So, I think that was, I know many people are sad, but I think it was a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
The other thing, so we should probably say at the outset, although three of us are not secular people, we're not Roman Catholic. My father's Roman Catholic. Tom's son is Roman Catholic as of Easter Sunday or Palm Sunday, was it, Tom? But this Pope, transcended the faith. He was a person in the world. He was a political person in a way not all popes are. And you talk about J.D. Vance being there. Andy reminded me, John Boehner wanted to meet the Pope, and he ran for speaker. And when he got to do it, he seemed to use the speakership to get to visit with the Pope, and then he seemed to lose interest in being speaker. It's like that was the pinnacle for him. And he tweeted today, John Boehner, that I'll just read his tweet. It's short, Andy. Quote, "Speaker, will you pray for me?" End quote. "With those words, Pope Francis changed my life. He will forever hold a place in American history as the first Pope to address a joint meeting of the United States Congress and in hearts across the world for his compassionate stewardship of the Church." So, that's one view. Now, he was a liberalizing influence, and we can talk about that in a minute in terms of the doctrinal, strictures in the Church about who can receive sacrament, divorced people and gay people. This is an incremental change. But also there was something I was really struck by today, and that was I was watching the way we always do in preparation for the show. I watched CNN, then MSNBC. They were very laudatory about the Pope, and I went, uh-oh. And I went to Fox News, and they were very laudatory of the Pope. And those three networks showed great respect and great sensitivity and on the same subject. And I don't think I'd seen that in 10 years.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good point. So Tom, he served for 12 years. He was Argentinian, so he was the first Latin American Pope. No big fan of Donald Trump, though. I think that's safe to say. So we're a political show. Let's talk about the politics.
Yeah, I mean, well, he was obviously a great historical figure in the sense that he was the first Jesuit, the first Latin American, as you said. He was the first one to speak to Congress. So he had a bunch of firsts during his 12-year tenure. But he was, to Carl's point, I mean, he was considered a liberal. I mean, he was, in some ways, a reaction to Pope Benedict, who resigned, right? Didn't die, but resigned. And who was more of a conservative traditionalist. And so Francis was sort of the opposite of that. And obviously, depending on where you stand or sit, you may have thought that was a good thing, or you may have thought that was not a good thing. I mean, he did liberalize the church in a number of different ways that I think, strict Catholics didn't always appreciate, or conservative Catholics didn't always appreciate. And he did. He inserted himself into some of these political discussions in ways that, I don't know that previous popes had done, certainly in that way. And so he was a controversial figure in that regard.
Mm-hmm. So, Carl, we can break it down a little bit. I mean, there are
Yeah.
at least three issues that I think of where his liberalism sort of brought him into conflict with conservatives and with not only conservative Catholics, but with the administration. He was very liberal on the environment, put out a couple missives sort of about global warming. And, for a pope who's not a scientist, it was kind of interesting. Immigration, he wrote in February that, what did he say about it? He said, he wrote to American bishops that Trump administration policy of removing criminal undocumented aliens, quote, will not end badly. Will end badly. And then abortion. He came into conflict with U.S. bishops, at least, because he seemed more tolerant on abortion than they would have liked.
Well, I don't know, Andy. They didn't change any doctrine though, and liberals are always pointing that out. But you're right about the migrant issue and the environmental issue. I would add the third one. I would say, Andy, is economics. You say he wasn't a scientist. He wasn't an economist either. And I thought it's not a surprise that a Jesuit priest from Argentina is a socialist or doesn't like capitalism. But I personally found his critiques of free market capitalism. I'm not Catholic, as I said, so I don't think the Pope is omniscient. I thought he was a little bit out over his skis on that, almost practicing medicine without a license. I think free market capitalism, in my opinion, has brought more people out of poverty in Africa than anything by far, anything. Nothing's close to it. So in this way, political conservatives in this country, didn't always agree with his take on politics and economics and the world. But there's an interesting Ross Douthat in the New York Times, who's a practicing Catholic and a very, very thoughtful person. He wrote a column today, said, it's the last imperial. The title of the column is Francis and the End of the Imperial Papacy. And what he writes about is that these things we're talking about, where suddenly conservatives who always had relied on the Pope, American conservatives, to back them on these issues, abortion and the life issues and other things, suddenly found themselves, in Ross's phrase, crosswise from papal authority. And then he adds that in the process, Francis helped demystify his office's authority and undermine its most imposing claims, because conservatives, the very people he unsettled, American conservatives especially, were the last believers in the imperial papacy. That they were the custodians of the infallibility mystique. And so what he's suggesting is that in being a man of the people, Francis also washed away this mystical authority that popes always had, that they could never be wrong. And I think that's also an interesting development. And I guess we'll see in the next pope, if whoever that turns out to be, whether Ross is right or not.
Yeah. Well, Tom, it is striking that Vice President Vance, who converted to Catholicism in 2019, I should say, was among the very last people to meet. I mean, the trip he was making, why was he seeing the Pope at this time? And what, just an interesting confluence of events, I guess.
It certainly was, and made more interesting by the fact that he and the Pope had sort of tangled publicly over the issue of immigration previously. And so, that added this other element to it. There was a funny thing that was on X earlier about, this JD Vance is like the Grim Reaper. The first thing was the college football trophy, and then it was a Pope, and then there was something else that he was knocking on the door of the next thing. Might be a little too soon for that kind of gallows humor, but look, the other issue that the Pope was involved in and inserted himself, as Carl mentioned, was on sort of gay rights, LGBTQ, and he famously said, right, if someone is gay but has a good heart, who am I to judge? That was who am I to judge? And I think conservatives would say that's the job, right?
Right.
If not you, who else?
Yeah, right.
I mean, you're the voice. Yes, you're supposed to be the instrument of God. That's
Would
what
you,
God does.
well, Tom,
Certainly in the Old Testament.
he would, because he was a man of the people, he was less susceptible to flattery than some popes. He couldn't be talked out of some of these things. Was in 2003, I was with George W. Bush, President Bush, when he went to the Vatican and spoke with John Paul II, and he had this thing that the cardinals there, the anti-war cardinals, had browbeaten the Pope into reading, and he read this thing, and he was prepared to read it to the president, and they informed the White House, and Karl Rove got wind of this and found out that the Pope really liked getting awards, and so they conjured up some award, some presidential award that they were. So Bush sat there and listened to the Pope rebuking him, and the Pope's reading it kind of by rote. You can see his heart's not really in it. And then Bush gets done and says, "Thank you, but I have this award to give you." And the Pope's face brightened up, and the meeting went really well. And I was in the pool, the White House pool, in the Vatican, and Karl Rove came out of that meeting and literally jumped up in the air and clicked his heels. I had never seen anybody do that. but this Pope was he couldn't be dissuaded that easily, apparently, from JD Vance. I guess it was a frosty but cordial meeting. Is that your impression, Andy?
That's the reporting, at least.
Yeah,
I mean, and certainly, in the context of what of his passing, it takes on a sort of a different light. But anyway, well, guys, this is Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom Bevan and Carl Cannon. Let's talk about immigration a little bit. Chris Van Hollen, senator from Maryland, was on television a lot on Sunday talking about his visit to El Salvador, where he met with Abrego Garcia. Today, 4 more Democrats are in El Salvador. Robert Garcia from California, Maxwell Frost from Florida, Yasmin Ansari from Arizona, and Maxine Dexter from Oregon, all Democrats, if I didn't say that. Apparently, Garcia has been moved to a different facility where he now has his own bed and furniture. So, Tom, what do you make of the Democrats down there and working this issue pretty hard? And like I said, Chris Van Hollen was everywhere this weekend.
He was. He almost did the full Ginsburg, appeared on every single Sunday show. I don't know that he was. Did he get every single one? He might have. But look, why are these other Democrats down there? This has nothing to do with this is not constituent service for them, right? He's not from their area. So why are they making such a show of this? And they clearly think that there's something.
How about for the reason you said, Tom? Because they saw how much TV Van Hollen got.
Well, exactly, and that's the point. I mean, Rep. James Comer, who's the chairman of the Oversight Committee in the House, released a statement last week because Democrats had come to him and said, "Look, we want to go on a trip to El Salvador," and he said, "Over my dead body, are you going to spend a single taxpayer dime to go down there? If you want to go, pay for it yourself." And in fact, Van Hollen was asked on one of the shows over the weekend, who paid for this trip? And he was like, "Well, it was a normal congressional trip." And I think maybe it was Dana Bash and CNN said, "So taxpayers paid for it." He was kind of like, "Yeah." Look, I don't know that taxpayers are going to be thrilled with spending their money to send Chris Van Hollen down there so he can, do his thing. I still don't know how this issue works for Democrats. I mean, Chris Van Hollen, he voted against the Laken Riley Act. There was a story on that over the weekend. The fact that he voted against that. I'm not sure he did anything for Rachel Marin, the mother of the woman who was killed by an illegal from, I think, El Salvador, Venezuela, in his state. And I'm not sure he's done anything for her. Hasn't spoken to her or nothing. And I have to check it. I don't want to. If he has, then good for him. But if he hasn't, shame on him, because he's ignoring that and spending all of this time and effort and money to meet with this guy who is, again, and we talked about this. Even if he manages to come back, as the administration has pointed out and other people have pointed out, he still had a legal deportation ordered against him. And the most likely outcome for him is that he'll get deported again, just to a different country.
Well, Carl, the four Congress folks who are down there now, their trip is paid for privately somehow. They've made that clear. So they won't get attacked, at least for that part of it.
That's because they wanted it paid publicly, but they couldn't get the money from Comer.
Right. But what do you make of this? And again, is this a winning issue for the Democrats?
I'm with Tom on this. I don't see how in a general election, if you look forward, this plays well. But all these members are, they're all from, Democratic states, Democratic districts, and clearly they think it helps them in their party. Then the question becomes, what's going on in the Democratic Party that this plays better than supporting the victims of violent crime from illegals? That's what the last election was about. The Republicans won that election. I'm a little surprised Cory Booker couldn't ace those people out and get there quicker than they did. But there's a larger issue here, and let's remind people of two facts. The first is that he wasn't just deported. If he was just deported, you and I wouldn't know his name and we wouldn't be talking about it. He was sent without being charged criminally in either country to a prison. That's the part that bothers Democrats. It bothers me, and it bothers the Supreme Court. It bothers Harvey Wilkinson, conservative judge of the Fourth Circuit. It bothers every single federal judge who's looked at it. So there's still this fight brewing about whether this administration will honor these court decisions. So that's, but the bigger issue is, we talked about an imperial papacy, but bigger issue is Trump's presidency. Is he going to follow the rule of law? He's going to stay within any established guardrails. And I think this defendant, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he's not a defendant. Again, he's never been charged, but this Maryland man, the phrase the White House doesn't want us to use, I think he's become a symbol. He's the battleground in this larger issue about presidential power and separation of powers.
He is, and look, he is, and Van Hollen says he's fighting for due process. He's not defending the man. He's defending due process, and all that is great. But this larger discussion, and I've brought it up before, but I think other people have started bringing it up. And over the weekend, I had read a couple of stories. The idea that Democrats can, Joe Biden can throw open the border and just bring in 11 million people, and that's considered completely fine. There's no overreach there. There's no constitutional crisis there. There's no nothing. And then we try and remove these people, and suddenly the legal system jumps into action, and all of these injunctions are if you have a situation where whenever a Democrat's in office, you can just throw open the border and import, bring in 10, 15, 20 million people illegally, but you can't ever get them out because of the injunctions and the lawsuits and this and that, then we're screwed as a country.
Well, to that point, the Supreme Court Saturday, at 12:55 in the morning, they issued this, blocked the Trump administration from deporting any Venezuelans that are being held in this northern Texas facility. Carl, setback for the Trump administration, but it's temporary, right?
Well, yeah, but Tom's point is the right one here, and it's one of the right points. And I've been on the other side, as we've talked about this the past week, but I want to emphasize what Tom just said, because that's the Democrats are going to have an answer for that. And here's the question: you can import people, you can basically throw open the border and lie about it, as the Biden administration did.
Well, you say you can, but
wait.
He did lose the election largely because of that. So
yeah, well, but that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is you can throw open the border, and then the estimates range. Let's say 4 or 5 million people come in. I think it's maybe twice that. But
I was going to say that's the first year. Carl.
Yeah, all right. Let's just take the first year. But then is the Supreme Court of the United States really going to say, okay, but to get them to leave, you actually have to handle each one of these cases separately? Does it have to be 4 million trials? That's not practical. And so So that's the other side of this argument about due process that this court's going to have to reckon with at some point. That's why I think taking these people straight off the street to prison in a foreign country, in some cases a country they'd never lived in. These Venezuelans, they were not from Salvador. That's what the court seems to have been wanting to stop. If it's just deportation, I think the administration is going to have a stronger political argument and by necessity a stronger legal argument.
Mm-hmm. Well, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, both dissented to this decision on Saturday, Tom. But it is a setback for the administration, isn't it? And it's a sort of a victory for the ACLU.
Sure. I mean, I think that, the Trump administration sort of urged the Supreme Court to allow them to continue. And they had given them sort of a partial victory by saying, look, that they can use the Alien Enemies Act, but now they've sort of temporarily paused it. So, look, I hope that this all gets sorted out quickly, and so that we can sort of and we avoid some massive constitutional car wreck here in the short term, or even the long term for that matter. But that's not clear at the moment how this is going to go, what the administration is going to do, and what some of these courts are ultimately going to decide. But it's a huge issue, and in some ways we've been headed for this issue for a long time, and Congress has never been able to pass any sort of comprehensive immigration reform. They've never even been able to actually pass not even comprehensive immigration for anything. There was always this idea, well, we'll start with border security. If we could just get border security and we can stop the flow of illegals, then we can deal with the folks who are here. But Democrats would never even go for that. It always had to be done all at one time, all in one piece. And that's never been successful since Reagan's, the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, what was that, Carl? 83, something like that?
1986, it was signed by President Reagan.
Yeah. So,
and that took 10 years to pass.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it also gave amnesty to however many,
3.1 million people, most of them Mexican Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. So we haven't been able to deal with our immigration problem. And then you throw on top of that Biden opened the borders and just imported all these millions of people. And to your point, Andy, he lost the election, but the deed was already done, right? That's already, there's no sort of, we're trying to clean that up now or reverse that, or however you want to describe it. And it's seems to be a real problem. And so we are where we are, and we've been, this moment has been building on this issue in particular for decades.
Yeah. Well, I want to just go back to the Chris Van Hollen for 1 second, because we spend a lot of time on this show bashing the press. Some more from Tom than from the two of us, maybe. But
I would say.
But I do want to give a little shout out to Dana Bash, because she did this interview with him on CNN and asked him what I thought was the best question of the weekend, when she asked him, well, you sat down with Abrego Garcia, did you ask him if he's a member of MS-13 or any other gang? And Van Hollen was sort of stumped, and his response was, well, I didn't ask him because I knew what his answer would be. And I just thought, in terms of a journalistic moment, it was a good one. It was a great question. So a little shout out to Dana Bash for asking the question that I didn't think of it before she asked it, but when she asked it, I said, wow, that's a great question.
And she also pinned him down on who paid for the trip.
Yeah, right.
Which were both good questions. And I haven't seen all of the interviews. I've seen clips of ones from ABC and CNN. Did anyone ask him though about Rachel Morin and what he's done on her behalf? Has he contacted her? Did he express remorse or condolences? Anything?
I will ask our crack research staff to look into that.
Because if Dana asked him that, we'd have to give her a Pulitzer Prize.
Exactly.
She may have. I don't recall that. But anyway, we're going to leave it there. Hey, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. Don't go away. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. And guys, Pete Hegseth is in a bit of hot water. The New York Times reported that the Secretary of Defense sent news about this Yemeni strike to a different group chat using the Signal app. It's kind of like what he did before, only this one had 13 people in it, including his wife and his brother. The president said today that Hegseth is doing a great job, and people should ask the Houthis how he's doing. But Carl, this is not a good look for Pete Hegseth this week, right?
No, the worry about him from the beginning was that he was inexperienced in government. He'd been in the army. He was a veteran, served with honor and distinction, but he'd never worked in the Pentagon. He'd never managed any organization that, he had kind of small nonprofit he'd run for a little while and then left under mysterious circumstances. They didn't sound great, but he lacked management experience, and people thought perhaps management skill. That now seems like a sound objection to have raised. How do you get, what's the qualifications for being Secretary of Defense? Well, being Deputy Secretary of Defense would have been nice, about being a United States Senator. There's other jobs that people have gone into that.
President of General Motors might have been nice, something like that.
Yeah, he didn't do real well though, so maybe we shouldn't use McNamara. But yeah, his inexperience is showing, and you got to think that he'd have been more careful because he was in there almost not confirmed. They just lit him up, and the Democrats did during his confirmation hearings. And I would have thought he'd been very careful and make sure he was doing everything right. But apparently that's not his style.
Yeah. Well, Tom, we had this piece from Politico from his former Pentagon spokesman, John Uliot, and he fired 3 senior staffers on Friday. And I got to say, I'm sort of struck by that this is the kind of error it seems like he's making, or the kind of conflict because you would have thought, if nothing else, he would have understood PR. He would have understood his how to handle the press, and he would have understand how to handle a story. But it seems like that is what's tripping him up, not some big policy issue.
Right. And look, I've said before, like, I know Pete. I think he's a good guy. I've spent some time with him. He's a Princeton grad, so I have a soft spot for him there. I would love to give him the benefit of the doubt on this stuff, but it doesn't look good. I mean, the people that left were 3 of his sort of most trusted senior aides that have been with him for a long time. And he turns around and says, oh, well, this is just, he said at the White House Easter egg roll, he was asked about it, and he said, this is just disgruntled employees that are sliming me and printing, it's just the hoaxster media, he called them. It just seemed like a deflection. And the thing, so the allegation is that he did this other signal chat. Remember, Mike Waltz is the one who started that one. Apparently Hegseth started this one and included his wife and brother. Now, I guess his brother's an employee of the Pentagon, but didn't really need to be included on any sort of, operational details. And certainly the wife, who's not a Defense Department employee. And there was a story about how she's been sitting in on meetings. Now, they claim that wasn't true, but nevertheless, that story was out there. So, why is she getting this kind of information? What possibly could she need it for? So it doesn't look good. I don't know whether he's gonna lose his job over it or not, but it certainly hasn't been, the easiest first 100 days for him. I mean, it's been kind of a mess. And if you read that Politico op-ed, which we ran, John Uliot, who left on, basically was there and then said, look, I'm gonna leave. He was offered a job to stay. He said no. And he said, look, he's a fan of Pete Hegseth. He's a fan of Donald Trump. But he said, look, it's a meltdown, I think was the word he used, inside the DOD. He did not paint a very pretty picture. And he's a guy who would, theoretically probably know what's going on because he just spent, a couple months there. So it doesn't look good.
We had him on our show. He was on this show and talked about a book he wrote, and he was very pro-Trump, very pro-Hegseth, very loyal guy. Yeah. And they've hung him out to dry, and now they're calling him names. It's not a good look.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
This is from the article. He said 2 things that struck me. He said, first was, quote, there are very likely more shoes to drop in short order, with even bigger bombshell stories coming this week. Key Pentagon reporters have been telling sources privately. And then he added this. He said, the president deserves better than the current mishegas at the Pentagon. Great word, mishegas, by the way. It's a Yiddish term. You guys can look it up. Given his record of holding prior cabinet leaders accountable, many in the secretary's own inner circle will applaud quietly if Trump chooses to do the same in short order at the top of the Defense Department. So, yeah, I mean, this guy is not he's a Trump loyalist, and feels like, I guess he's speaking truth to power on this, Carl.
Well, I think he feels that he was stabbed in the back. And what he's saying is that Pete Hegseth is embarrassing the president, and that's not what you want in your defense secretary.
Yeah. Tom, what's the over/under on Hegseth staying? The president came out today and supported him, so we know that.
Right, and
it's behind him 1,000%.
I think the line you just read, Andy, if there are more shoes to drop, if there's more stuff coming out that is going to be unflattering, I mean, at some point you're going to reach critical mass where Trump is going to not appreciate all of the distractions that are going on. I mean, look, I thought, as I said, it was on record, not just with Pete Hegseth, but with a lot of Trump's nominees. Look, this is who the president wants. He was duly elected, and I thought the Democrats, quite frankly, treated Hegseth really poorly when trying to imply that he was a drunkard and all these things, right? The stuff with the women. I mean, it was a real smear job, and I thought he deserved better than that. I was glad he got confirmed and got through that. I think it would have been a travesty if he hadn't gotten an opportunity to do the job because of those kinds of smears. However, since he's been in office, since he's been at the helm of the Pentagon, it has been a rough ride, and so we'll see. Trump's standing by him, and look, if you've got Trump, I mean, he's the only guy that matters. So all the rest of the stuff is noise.
Yeah.
Unless and until Trump decides he wants to go in a different direction, yeah. Pete Hegseth is going to be the Secretary of Defense.
All right. Well, speaking of noise, there was a lot of noise in London over the weekend. There were protests on Saturday. These were in reaction to the UK Supreme Court's decision that the word woman refers to a biological category, not a sense of one's gender. And Tom, we have this colorful article from Spiked on the front page of RCP today. I'm just tell us about the article and why'd you decide to put it on the front page?
Well, it's just so it's Jo Bardosh who writes for Spiked magazine, and she wrote, and the title on the piece is "A Trans Activist Temper Tantrum," and she sort of takes a critical look at the protest that took place in Parliament Square, and there was some defacing of monuments. There was chanting F. Who was it for? J.K. Rowling. Right. They wanted to string her up. So and the subhead on this piece was it was a carnival of misogyny and public urination. So I just thought it was obviously provocative and certainly critical, but very well written, and I gave you a flavor of what it was like there yesterday.
Yeah, it's a great piece. People should read it. I guess they did have a pee protest or something, but these transgendered individuals all publicly urinated. Carl?
Yes, but yes, and if you're there saying a man is really a woman, if he says he's a man, probably you shouldn't be acting like a man, defacing monuments and peeing on bushes like you're, but there, everybody there were some women there too. And this piece we're talking about had a great line, transition. Next came a dull vagina owner who said her name was not important. I just thought that was the sentence of the day.
Good. But Tom, so seriously though, this came out in the piece, and I read it elsewhere as well. This all has to do with this Scottish Parliament ruling from a couple of years back. They passed a law that 50% of what they call the non-executive members of the board of public entities, I guess those are just government agencies or something, that they had to be women. And then that raised the question of who exactly is a woman under the law. And that's what this is all about. So it pits these feminists against these gender rights advocates, I guess, in an interesting way, and does raise a serious public policy question, which is, if you are going to have quotas set on these mutable qualities if a man can become a woman, how do the quotas mean anything? Maybe you shouldn't have quotas at all.
Look, the tension between the feminists and the LGBTQ community has been there for a while, and it continues to rise. I mean, that's what J.K. Rowling basically talks about. I mean, she's painted as a transphobe and a bigot and all those things, but
and a right winger.
Yeah, but in her mind, I mean, she's trying to protect women, and she considers herself a feminist, and she wants to protect the rights of women and women's spaces and women's sports and all of these things. And so now the LGBTQ folks would look at her and think that she's not actually doing that. And so that's where this tension comes from. But we see it in the United States. I mean, we just talked about the Title IX stuff that's been going on, right? Title IX was established to help women compete in athletics in college. And now we're seeing, again, may only be a handful at the moment of men who are claimed to be women who are competing and taking podium spots and scholarships and victories from girls and women who have worked really hard to get where they are. So this is an ongoing thing, and it's only going to get worse, in my opinion.
Yeah, Carl, last word.
Well, it's not an easy issue. We shouldn't pretend it is. Tom says these are men claiming to be women. Yeah, I would stipulate there's no evidence that they're committing fraud, that there's men who just couldn't cut it and said, oh man, if I could just claim I was a woman, I'll go compete, I could win medals. I think these people do live their lives as women, and that's how they identify. Then the problem goes, but they're jocks. They've been playing sports. So they're like, should they still have to compete with men, or can they compete with women because they live the rest of their life with women? So it's not an easy issue. The problem for me is that my instinct would be to say, let them compete where they want. The problem, of course, is that biological men have such an advantage in these kind of sports. Not every sport, but not equestrian, but in the sports, powerlifting, boxing, basketball, volleyball, baseball, football. That's track and field, swimming. That's the problem, is that it's not fair. And that's the word Gavin Newsom used when he was asked, when he was talking about this with Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk put it to him pretty tough. And Charlie's, this up and coming conservative who's got this big following and is a good representative of Trump world, and as Tom likes to say, about 80% of the American people. And Governor Newsom, who's been very much in the vanguard. California's been leading the way, as it always does, on trans rights. He was forced to say, because Gavin was a jock in high school, and played college, he was forced to say, yeah, it's not fair. So that's where we are.
Right. Andy, I think that Carl has a secret bet with someone that every time he brings up Gavin Newsom in a podcast, he gets $100 or something. I don't know.
If it
always happens.
I didn't know how we'd wind that one back to Gavin Newsom, but we did, Carl.
If it's true, Tom, I could go buy that pickup truck now and pay cash for it.
All right. Well, guys, we're going to leave it there. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've been talking with Tom and Carl, but don't go away. We'll be back with more Real Clear Politics right after these words. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics. I'm Andrew Walworth, and we have a new feature on the RCP website. It's an interview series from Real Clear Investigations, hosted by Maggie Miller. She talked with Joel Kotkin, a contributor at Real Clear Investigations, who recently filed a two-part report on the state of California. Here's Maggie Miller in conversation with Joel Kotkin.
Joel, thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure.
How are we seeing such dysfunctional outcomes coming from such credentialed leaders?
California, basically dominated the last part of the 20th and the early part of the 21st century. I think there was so much money being generated that it became possible for people to think, oh, we can lead the fight on climate change. We can lead the fight on transgender, all these causes. Because we had enough money to make up for the fact that maybe some businesses didn't like what they were doing. And unfortunately, what it did is it created not a progressive society, but a regressive one where class differences are very high, where upward mobility is very difficult.
I mean, you just mentioned it. Your piece shows that progressivism can have a regressive arc. Why is that happening?
A lot of it comes from the big tech companies. So there are people who really have no particular knowledge or even exposure to what most of America is about. They have their ideas, and very often it's their children or their spouses, and they just throw millions of dollars in this direction. When you have in the state of California, four or five of the leading companies in the world, in almost all located within 20 miles of each other, you're going to get a confluence of delusion, if you will, that everything's perfect. We're the model. Everybody looks up to us. The fact that home ownership is hard, that people are leaving, that younger people are particularly stressed out, that doesn't really matter because they live in their own bubble, and it's a big bubble. It's a bigger bubble than Washington, D.C.
And California's climate law recognizes that the state cannot affect the climate without the world following suit. How do you rationalize climate and energy policy that is at the detriment of your people in your state that you're supposed to be helping?
Well, first of all, I think the people who make these decisions, frankly, to take a line from from Gone with the Wind, they don't give a damn. I mean, fundamentally, these people, it's not that they don't like them or they want them to suffer. It's that they don't exist. California is a very big state. And if you are, let's say, in the Bay Area and the few parts of, let's say, West Los Angeles, and you live in one universe, you have no idea that if you drive down Highway 33 from LA up towards the Bay Area, off the main freeway, you will see poverty that is very similar to what you see in Mexico or India. But these people don't exist. Plus, when you look at the tech companies in particular, they don't hire a lot of blue collar workers. They don't have to deal with unions. Their contacts are overwhelmingly with other people who have certainly bachelor's degrees, in many cases, masters and PhDs. So they live in a different world than the rest of us live in. And so they fundamentally don't really have to pay attention to it. Plus, in alliance with the oligarchs has been, of course, the tremendous amount of the growth in the sort of college-educated professional class, much of whom work in government, and those people are particularly tend to be very cause-oriented. And in the state of California, they've been the one group that has middle incomes that are going up. Everybody else is pretty much losing.
Since what ails California can be found in some of our greatest cities in our country, what can they do to solve their wrongs?
Well, the first thing is to say, okay, what is our goal? And, being sort of an old social democrat myself, the goal should be, how do we improve life for more of the people? So how do we make the economy work for them? That's not what we're doing now. For instance, climate policy, the way it's now looked at, is as if California was like a country or even a planet unto itself. And if we reduce our emissions, the world will be much better off. Well, frankly, California doesn't matter. It doesn't emit enough to make a difference. And if it emitted a little bit more, it would probably be better because people wouldn't be buying things made in China with coal or even to a place like Texas. So I think what the climate policy does is it pushes out what you might call the carbon economy. In other words, logistics, trucking, construction, manufacturing, agriculture, all of those are severely affected. So we got to let those sectors grow again, because there has to be a future for those people who don't have PhDs from MIT.
What sort of feedback have you gotten so far on this new reporting that you did?
Well, I got some very nice feedback from my friends up in the Bay Area. I think that there's a recognition, a broad recognition, even among people who are traditionally liberals, that something has to be changed. And, to give him credit, I make fun of Gavin Newsom because he's fun to make fun of. But, in a way, Newsom at least understands that there's something happening out there, that people are not happy with this current regime. They do not feel optimistic about the state. And I think to give at least Newsom some credit, he understands that there's anger out there. And if you go in California outside of the Bay Area and parts of LA, you'll find a state where there's a lot of dissatisfaction. And I think that what really needs to happen now is you need to put more pressure on people to say, we don't want these kinds of policies. We want to change things. We want a future for our kids. And right now, the political leadership isn't doing that at all.
Well, Joel, this was a fantastic piece that really outlined all the issues that California is facing and hopefully what the path forward could be. Anything else you'd like to add as we wrap things up?
Yeah, I think the one thing I want to add is that for all its problems, I'm still here. I'm staying in California. There is no state that has what California has in terms of topography, climate, the intellectual and technological skills that are here. So I think California can come back. I just think we need to change direction and begin to realize that California is really about a, if you will, an extended version of the American dream, and we have to pursue policies that make that possible.
You've been listening to Maggie Miller in conversation with reporter Joel Kotkin. You can hear and see more of Maggie's interview on RealClearInvestigations.com and on the RCP YouTube channel. That's our program for today. On behalf of Carl, Tom, and everyone here at Real Clear Politics, thank you for tuning in. Join us again tomorrow. Have a great evening.